Awesome. So I know that the rest of the folks are not able to, I'm not able to see you or hear you, the attendees, but I just want to welcome you to our second Talabat Tech Talks. And we're so honored to have Chris and Austin with us. And Chris and Austin are hosts of the Mob Mentality Show, which is a video cast that they learn so much from. They touch upon all topics related to mob programming and surrounding teams around mob programming. And I got to learn a lot from the conversations that they had with their guests. So if you happen to not follow the Mob Mentality Show, I strongly recommend to check it out. And yeah, today's session is going to be led by Chris and Austin, and they had in mind the session where we get to ask them about the topics that we are interested in and the burning questions that we might have related to mob programming. And yeah, we'll get to figure out the ways to, we'll get to vote on the questions and talk about the ones that tend to be most popular. So yeah, without further ado, thanks again, Chris and Austin, for joining us today, and I hand it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. And yeah, so I'm Chris Lucian. Austin Chadwick is with me here as well. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start talking a little bit about high quality, high release frequency, psychological safety, and then then basically open it up to questions in the Q&A section. In the Q&A section in Zoom, you have the ability to vote on other questions that you like. So please pay attention to that. And you can also comment on those, so you can give a thumbs up. I see a really good question there already that I really want to answer right away. But I'm going to give a little bit of time for people to kind of add questions and vote for things. And I'm going to basically screen share a video while we kind of start the conversation, and then we'll kind of go into that. So first of all, I'm going to just kind of share this, which is a short video of our environment before we went remote. This was in 2016. And while we do that, maybe Austin, what are your thoughts on high psychological safety in a software development environment?
Yeah. So I appreciate that, Chris. So while you guys are adding your great questions, and I already see a bunch coming in, which is I'm excited to get to. Yeah, we'll kind of hit quickly high quality, high release frequency, and high psychological safety. So yeah, regarding high psychological safety, so for me, I came from a background that was not mob programming, and then we started to tinker with it and experiment with it a little bit. And then once I joined the environment you're seeing on the screen, where it was mob programming all day long, in person for a while, then remote, I saw a huge jump in psychological safety. And I think one reason is that it's very natural and human to have higher levels of psychological safety, which is where you share your full self, you share your opinions, you share your concerns, you grow in your ability to give radical candor to each other, where you're kind but also direct, and giving feedback to each other or feedback on the code. And I think a big reason that it comes with mob programming often, mob programming is not a panacea that will solve all problems and it always works. But why it works often, at least in my experience, is that you just become really good friends with the people you're working with. You experience the code together, you experience interactions with the customers and stakeholders together. It's natural to ask what someone thinks about something, or to affirm, to agree with what they say, or to ask questions about it if you have concerns, or to say, I think the thing I love the most is let's just try it. Most often, I think the context of this environment is it's with software. And the nice thing about that is it's pretty easy to try most things. And so I think that really boosts psychological safety, is when someone has an idea and you're like, let's try it, let's see how it works. How about for you, Chris?
I just would define psychological safety as the ability to give feedback and not fear retaliation from the individual. Maybe that's the only thing I would add. And then maybe, just talking about mob programming and high release frequency very quickly for kind of our intro topics, and we can dig more into these as you have questions. But one thing that we noticed is that when we were all working separately, every card took a lot longer to do. And when we started working together, our release frequency kind of naturally went up. We were able to just essentially get everything out of the way, release, very quickly. And we got, the quality side of it allowed us to do that. And one thing is that with everybody kind of reviewing the code all at the same time, while building out the code, there's very little refactoring that needed to happen. And so I will turn that off now. And that video was on YouTube, and I saw a question out there for where you can get it, and I'll link it as soon as I can. And so we implemented continuous integration, continuous delivery very quickly as part of the natural kind of cadence of the group, because we found that things that were very short to do that people did manually, like maybe deploying to a staging environment, that became painful for people to do, and we automated it, and we saved quite a large amount of time, where I think it would have been less likely that we would have automated something like that had everybody been working by themselves again. And Austin, maybe I'll kick it off to you for high quality, and then we can get into some of these great questions.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'll add a little bit on the high release frequency, going from a non-mobbing environment to the one that was. And so I joined a team, a mob, an ensemble that was doing a language I had never worked in. But my first day, I jumped in, I was learning that language, I was contributing to the thinking and the problem solving, and we released to production the first day. And that blew me away compared to other environments I've been in. And so I agree that tends to be a high correlation with high release frequency in mob programming. And in regards to quality, another kind of before and after moment for me was I came from an environment where, the people were trying really hard. They were learning, pretty decent quality practices, but for whatever reason, we had, in the hundreds of bugs that we were fixing or, carrying through month to month. And then when I came into this environment, like before, it's not perfect. There have been times where the bug frequency was higher, but definitely orders of magnitudes way lower. I think it fits kind of what Arlo Belshe calls the hashtag bug zero, where it's literally zero, or it's kind of like, oh yeah, we did have a bug last month, but we fixed it, and it's done. It's in that really low quality. And so yeah, since I've been doing it, been long stretches. I think about a year and a half, where the bug reports were incredibly low, if not zero. And so so very excited about that. And I think one reason why it might be so with mob programming is maybe going back to a Deming quote that I don't have in front of me, so I'm going to paraphrase it and not quote it exactly, but basically saying inspection is too late for quality, right? You want to build quality into the product. And that kind of statement always puzzled me before, because I'm like, well, every type of QA I know of is always inspection. What would you possibly mean by building quality in? And then after doing mob programming and often combining it things with like TDD, you really see how quality is built into the product as opposed to it being, so to speak, inspected in afterwards. So yeah, is it maybe now a good time, Chris, to jump to some of the questions? Yeah,
let's do it. So what I want to do is I want to invite the people to ask the questions to come and speak. And the top two questions are actually asked by the same person. So I'm going to just invite you here. I'm not going to try and pronounce names, but if you could please introduce yourself if you do accept the invite to talk. And so I just allowed for you to talk. You could ask your question live if you like, or I can read it out. It's up to you. Yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I am Joaquin Raya.
Nice to meet you.
I run a small team here in Talabat, and we have been trying mobbing for a while. And as a manager, one of the challenges that I have is that it's very difficult to determine performance. And that is a blocker for evolving the careers of my engineers. So what would you recommend in order to solve that problem?
Yeah, maybe I can answer what we've been doing for the last, I'd say 6 years. We actually, the best people to know in a mob who should be promoted is the people that they work with, right? Because they're there every day, they see their growth in the skills. And so we actually have a promotion nominations process. And so essentially people can nominate each other every month. We take nominations. And then what I do is essentially a monthly histogram over time over that data. And we've used that promotion process. And then basically we take the available budget and we promote as many people as possible within that budget. And people can nominate no one. So they must enter a nomination, but they can nominate, they could say that they don't want to nominate anybody because no one's ready to be promoted yet. And so this process has worked very well. I always ask people, we always do a retrospective and redefine the promotion process as a team in a retrospective, and every year. And essentially, we've never had a retrospective that was saying we should get rid of the process and change it to something else. It's always been, how do we make it better? How do we make it more consistent? And so it used to be end of the year nominations at the end, then it became monthly, then it became you're required to enter it but monthly, but you can signify that you don't want anybody there. And the data is very robust around that. And another thing that I think managers have to say why they're making the promotion. One thing we do when we collect nominations is we ask for a story, an anecdotal story about why they believe that person should be promoted. And those stories accumulate over the year. And now you have 2 pages of material about why that person should be promoted. And so that's been a really great process for us. Does that
How do you stop that from becoming a popularity contest, though?
Yeah, so that's another good question. There's a couple of things. It just depends on the size of the team, but a little bit of the popularity contest you'd actually want, right? So if somebody's really easy to work with, if they know what they're doing, if they're not dragging the team down, then they probably do deserve to be promoted because they're pulling the team forward. But I also think that in a large enough team that I'm talking about maybe 20 people or so, you won't really see that because especially if you're rotating people between mobs. So we do have a rule in our mobs that no one can stay on the same product for more than 2 years. And that kind of breaks up silos. It kind of breaks up, other things like that. But that randomness, the moving around, you start working with other people, and then people nominate around that. So when reviewing the data, I've never seen a situation where it was like, this person is just really popular, but their technical skills aren't great, because you're navigating, you're driving, you're researching. When you're in a mob, it very much is about how you're contributing to the mob, how you're making the mob better, and people giving nominations undeserved would just be really obvious to the team, and that would come out very quickly in retrospectives, I think.
Right, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. You had another question. It's also got the top number of votes. So maybe you wanted to introduce that one with cross-platform work as well.
It seems that I'm very popular.
Yeah.
So, in Talabat, our app is a native app. So we have Android developers that are experts in their Android knowledge and platform-specific stuff, iOS developers with the same situation, and then backend developers. And obviously, it's difficult to guarantee quality and knowledge on all 3 platforms. Mm-hmm. It's very different from web development, where a backender and a frontender can sort of work on each other's areas. So I would like to know how you handle that, and how long is the learning curve, and etc.
Yeah, so we don't we don't really put restrictions on technologies. Maybe Austin, you want to go ahead and answer this one?
Yeah, so this might jump into where you were going with it, Chris, was kind of the extreme ownership that each team or mob has. And so, you might join a team or an ensemble and they're already working in a particular tech stack, or there were some decisions made in the past. But that team, that ensemble, that mob has the ability to change anything in relation to that, like the technology used, this or that, and so often there is cross-platform work going on. So to your specific question regarding Android, iOS, and backend, I think we have experience directly regarding to front end and back end. But for the apps I've ensembled in, we typically use cross frameworks like Xamarin or something like that, where you write it in one language and it will transpile to both iOS and Android. But I think the spirit of the question still applies, is that back end, front end, any differentiation of technology, skill, role, etc. So we definitely see that. So some people, I've been in mobs who come from a very low level programming embedded background. I've been in mobs with people who are very data centric. I've been in mobs with people who are very front end. They love the front end infrastructure. So those are the types of experiences I have. And the thing that I see is when we mob together is we start to cross-train each other on each other's skills. So for example, an area of how to do infrastructure as code and CI/CD pipelines was an area of fairly low knowledge for me. But after mobbing with some phenomenal people who are really great in that, I learned how to research like they do, how to Google things, why to write the YAML like this versus not like that, and so I think a pretty awesome thing comes whether you're full-time ensembling or part-time mobbing, that these people will start training each other naturally. And then what that means is you don't have the bus factor, right? So if the Android guy or person goes on vacation for a month, development won't stop, right? Because people are cross-training, can help each other out. Chris, did you have anything else to add to that one?
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Does that answer your question? Is that good? You're muted if you're
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
It doesn't really answer it in the sense of it gives me a way of solving the problem, but it's close enough. So thank you very much.
Yeah. So my recommendation there when you're trying to do that is really to just put as much I guess control into the people's hands who are doing the work, right? And retrospect about it, talk about benefits and detriments, and I think, as Austin's saying, the transfer of skills happens very naturally as well, right?
And
we have observed that. It's just that getting them to be good enough to be able to work on all three would take so much time that it would be too expensive to do. But it's a trade-off, and that's fair enough.
Yeah, and I think that is a valid concern. And before ensembling, and then so this might come down to I'll share a link in the chat and in the show notes. Everything Chris and I are saying today is under the spirit of just sharing. So complex, the software world, teams working together is very, very complex and even chaotic at times. And so it's really hard to give like hard and fast recommendations to anything. So what we can do is share from our experiences. And then what you can do is maybe take that and it might result in an experiment of some kind. And what I can say, no, that's great. And it's wonderful learning from you all too. And I think what I can say is to share from my experience on that, to think if you would have asked me like 8 years ago, Austin, would you be capable in this many languages, front end, back end, infrastructures? I would have thought you were crazy, right? But in a matter of a couple years, I've seen people pick up these skills, people further along in their career, people at the beginning of their career, people in the middle of their career, pick up these skills pretty quickly. And I guess the only way you can find out is if you try in your environment, because in my experience, it's surprising how quickly people learn as opposed to how slow they learn as far as different, because at the end of the day, what I've noticed after being in 5 different teams, all these different technologies and languages, is there's a ton in common. And so a lot of things build on top of each other as opposed to being like completely independent areas of knowledge that have no overlap. So.
And maybe I'll add like one interesting experiment. I don't know if you can try it or not, but maybe this will be a kind of a final comment. Is get a Android and an iOS developer together. Maybe find somebody that knows Windows Phone still, and then have them build the feature in all 3 side by side. And I think that there'll be a lot of kind of empathy and understanding built up, because what I find is the difference between frameworks is actually not that different. Each system has their life cycle. The life cycles are very similar, but things are different, named differently. And once people start creating an abstract language about the different technologies that do the same things, often it's very small minutia that is actually fundamentally different between the platforms. But yeah, and hopefully that helps. And we can move on to our next question now. Let's see. Okay, so Tim, I'll allow you to talk. All right. Hi, Tim. Welcome. Would you like to answer your question that has 12 votes on it?
Hello. Yeah, I'm super curious to learn what were your learnings moving into this remote times, because as we've seen in the video, you started this process probably in the physical office environment.
Yes.
So what were your learnings and how you adjusted it to keep it effective in remote, or maybe even in hybrid modes where you have some people in the office and some people remote?
Yeah, I have a quick story, and then I'll kick it over to Austin about the hybrid scenario. So we did have people that was like, one person in the mob was remote because they just kind of had to move away for kind of life reasons. And so we actually had a monitor in that environment that you saw in the video earlier. And the monitor was on a stand and had its own computer, and basically they were essentially sitting next to us on the stand. And that was pretty effective because, as long as the person that's hybrid is on a dedicated machine that is at eye level, so that body language still comes across, like I'm going to go look at that person versus look at the screen. And another thing that helped was putting them in a position where the monitor that they had the code on was looking away from the camera, so that you knew that they were either looking at the code or looking at you when speaking. And so that was a pretty interesting hybrid example, but maybe Austin, you can talk a little bit more about our transition to remote.
Yeah, and I can share it from my experience. And I was going to actually share a live remote session, but it doesn't look like I have the ability to share. So maybe I'll send it to Chris and you can share it. Let me grab the link. I'll send this to you, Chris, privately over the chat real quick. Cool. Yeah, and I think if you go about halfway through that video, Chris, and put it up on the screen, it kind of gives an idea of what it looks like in action. Yeah, it is about the 11, 12-minute mark, Chris. But yeah, so from my experience, I actually came into remote mobbing or ensembling pretty skeptical. I remember talking with Chris before about when we were doing it all in person. And he asked me, well, what do you think about remote? And I'm like, I just feel like it's probably not going to be as good. I know people are doing it around the world. And then COVID started, and basically there was no choice anymore, right? So I was on a mob of 3, and I have to admit the first day was kind of rough. But right after the first day, because we were basically rapid cycling, trying a bunch of different ways to do it. And what we learned pretty quickly was you find your groove for whatever technologies you're working on, whatever your current setup is at home or wherever your remote office is from, getting the screens right, getting the devices set up, getting the audio video, figuring out your mobbing technology, whether it's something like AnyDesk or TeamViewer to share a remote computer together, or if it's kind of the mob command line tool where you're basically switching between driver and navigator by pushing things up to get. We found our groove pretty quickly. I think the first day was kind of rough, but then day 2, 3, 4, 5, and beyond, I think my brain has completely tricked me into it almost being equivalent, where I turn over and look at if I'm mobbing with Chris, and I see Chris Pixels, but it feels just like I'm talking to Chris in person because I see his body language. We're both looking at the screen together, just as we were in person. And so by and large, it feels very similar to me. And I think your question was going back to it, to keep it effective in remote times. I think the biggest thing to keep it effective is the same way to keep any process effective, in my experience, whether it's mobbing in general or remote mobbing, is that continuous retrospectives, right? And so can be the end of a little mobbing session for an hour or two and just ask, oh, how was that? Any pains to address? Any good things to turn up? And I think if you have that going and you keep refining your process, you'll find something that works great for everybody. I don't know, Chris, anything to add there?
Yeah, I'll just say that I actually view it as more effective because all of the things that you lose from the in-person, what I've found is that in the past, we had a very large campus and people wanted to favor in-person meetings over phone calls. And so I would see teams waiting for people that they needed, sometimes for hours, because they were waiting for that person to be available to walk to the physical location to have that conversation in person. And so that became always just a phone call. And that was really beneficial to, I think, the flow efficiency of the team, because people stopped waiting and there was less queuing time to answering important questions for people that had other things to do across the company, and there was a lot less walking time between events like that, because there wasn't any, right? It was instantaneous. And so I see, I find that there are very, very tiny trade-offs for the in-person to remote, but I think the other way, being remote, the queuing time for information is much, much lower. So I actually personally think that from a lean flow efficiency standpoint, remote is actually much more effective than mobbing in person.
Yeah, and I think that's been true for me too, because anytime, the thing with mobbing is get the whole system in the room, right? And so in person, sometimes that's more difficult unless they're really, but once everyone's remote, there's been times where we're like, okay, we need the system in the room, and boom, we pull on this person. Oh, we discover we need this person. Boom, pull on this person. And it's like jumping geographically across the world and organizations. And then you get the whole system in the room, you solve it, and that flow efficiency kicks in. Yes, I think I know what you're talking about, Chris. Yeah.
And then I think, James, you also had a very similar question. It also has a high number of votes. So I just wanted to ask if you had any more to add to that.
No, I think that covered most of what I was curious about. I guess one other issue that I run into is teams on different continents. And we may only have half a day with some of the folks. And that leads me down the path of thinking, how often do you mob? Like, does that make sense to say we're going to mob this amount of time per day, or and how do you deal with teams that are disconnected so far by geography and time?
Yeah, I think that so I have two kind of comments there. Because we do have team members that are in Australia as well as the Pacific time zones, and so we have some very difficult things. So sometimes when they want to mob, they everybody just shifts their hours in the direction to get more overlap. And then, but also I think that if you do have like a truly global team, one thing to consider is a 24-hour-a-day mob. Which can, basically people roll on and roll off out as the time zones change, or maybe a 16-hour mob or something like that, where, maybe you have 3 people that are working in one time zone and 3 people that are working in another, and maybe during their overlap, rather than having them working separately, have all of them join to 6 people and share that context, and then continue that context through the next 6-8 hours. And so those are all really I think interesting experiments to run, and we've had some success with basically people in the Australian time zone mobbing with people in the Pacific time zone, and bringing the code along from kind of one time zone, the bulk of one time zone to the other. So that's actually an interesting thing to try. So hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. And Tim, did you have anything else before we moved on?
No, thanks for sharing.
Awesome, great. All right, I will invite Stephen in. All right, Stephen, would you like to kind of announce your question, and kind of as a reminder to everybody, this is being recorded for to be on the Mob Mentality Show as well. So just letting you know.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Hi, nice to meet you. And Austin, thank you very much for liking one of my LinkedIn posts once. That was very exciting for me. So this is a very timely conversation today, because just yesterday in my team, we were having we have this quarterly team retreat, and we talk about ways of working and how we can improve. And some of the developers were expressing some frustration about how they have to wait for each other to collaborate, right? Like, for example, the data scientists want time with the data engineers, but they're working on different things in parallel. And it's like, oh, I wish I could get more of their time. And I suggested that, well, wouldn't it be great if everyone just worked together on one thing at a time? And then this way we could somehow increase the throughput. And I think they found this kind of ridiculous, that they would work on one thing at a time all the time. In fact, it seemed obvious to them that it would be slower, that maybe you would mob sometimes for specific reasons on certain tasks where it made sense, but especially because some of them are front end, some of them are back end, some of them data engineer. Data science even is very different from other areas of expertise, that it's clearly faster for them to work in parallel. And I kind of, struggle to convince them otherwise. In fact, I'm literally making eye contact with one of them right now, who's listening into this call, and who very graciously decided to join to try and be persuaded that that there is a better way of working, that this can increase the throughput, and that if we do collaborate, not only is it better for everyone as far as sharing knowledge, but there is in fact no trade-off as far as throughput. But I have no data to show. I only have your expertise to offer as evidence.
Yeah, Austin, maybe you want to get us started, and I have a comment when you're done.
Sure. Yeah, this is a very rich topic that could probably take up 3 hours of Lean Coffee. So thank you so much for raising it. This is fantastic. But we'll do our best to address it here. So the first thing I would want to put right out front is, at least for me, and is the idea of free choice and freedom and autonomy and kind of leadership principles. Thank you, Chris, for recommending the book, Turn the Ship Around, where you give the power to the team, you let the team decide. Because I think what people hear with this is, maybe they hear with agile transformations and other stuff is, oh, here comes something that's going to be forced on the team, and whether you like it or not, it's happening kind of deal. And so I think establishing kind of that psychological safety of, hey, you all decide how you want to work. And but with that in mind, here's some things to consider. And I think to have this kind of a debate or a healthy discussion is fantastic. But when it comes to action, you make it available for those who want to try to experiment to try it, so they can really try it. And it can start as an abstract discussion, but then it turns into an experiment where they can see the results, and the people who want to try it get a chance to, and the people who are skeptical can watch and see how it goes, right? And I think the skepticism is good. I think it does sound quite ridiculous. I think I just sent a bunch of things in the chat that might help get the research or discussion started. But I think the big difference is kind of how you started to address it, is it's a big mental switch in what counts as efficiency, right? So I think up until a few years ago, the mental model I had of efficiency was, how fast can I churn out output in my tiny little system? So if I'm a programmer, how fast am I churning out lines of code or completed tickets or those kind of things, right? And from that perspective, mob programming sounds ridiculous because you're taking one person churning out output to a group of people churning out output.
I believe the exact comment was, isn't my time better spent doing something else?
Right, exactly, yeah. So, but at least in my experience, in my context, me churning out output isn't directly delivering something of value to a customer or internal stakeholder, right? It has to go through various people and queues and waiting and process. So this is where lean thinking comes in. What are the wastes involved in the whole system, not just what Austin produces on his computer and sends to someone else? And I actually will, in one of those resources, I think I put it in there, is a link to, if you're looking for data, Dragan Stefanovic, who we've had on the show and is actually part of the organizers today, has actually collected data on this with code review and seeing all the waiting and queuing. And I think the title of this thing is Code Reviews Are Killing Your Company's Throughput, right? And so I think to do two things. One, start talking about kind of a lean thinking. Two, not just compare mobbing in the abstract, but compare it with the main competitor, so to speak, which is code review, right? Or some sort of process where people review each other's work. And then you look at the whole system and then think about, okay, which process has lower cycle time? Which process has better throughput? Which has better quality, right? So if do me and Chris work through a quality issue much faster when we're talking to each other? Or if I send it to Chris, he looks at it 2 days later and then sends me a comment that I'm not sure what he's saying back in a few words, you know? So I don't know, Chris, anything to add there?
So there's a really great TED Talk called The Efficiency Paradox, which talks about resource efficiency versus flow efficiency. And I think exactly what you're trying to describe here with you and your colleagues is directly related to that video. And it basically outlines lean flow efficiency, and there's tons of data around flow efficiency versus resource efficiency. There's a great book by the Poppendieks called Lean Software Development. And the idea of lean is, getting something across the finish line is much more important than keeping everybody fully utilized. And so when they're saying, isn't my time better utilized elsewhere? I think the answer is yes, because is no, because you're in the mob at the time and you're getting something delivered. And so the cost of delay for that feature getting to the release is actually being realized earlier. And if that feature is valuable enough, it could even mean that that person's salary, while they're just being available to deliver that feature, will be covered by that feature being released earlier and higher quality. And so there's also kind of that ping pong ball experiment that we can put a link out there for as well. But I would definitely, all of the metrics around resource efficiency versus flow efficiency, there's tons of science and data, because people have studied lean in manufacturing, pretty much forever now, at least in depth since the 60s. And all of that material applies, I think, directly to that situation that you're talking about there. Any follow-up to that, Stephen?
No, this is terrific. I like the experimentation approach, because I think people just need to experience these things for themselves, no matter how much data I even could show them. In fact, Dragan used to be a colleague of mine, and he has spoken to my team directly about these topics, and I'm often in touch with him and trying to channel him. But I think I need to up the ante as far as being a bit of an annoying manager and just sort of encouraging people to try these things out. I always tell them, you don't have to do this, but if you're feeling this pain, how about you try to solve the problem and remove the pain instead of keep doing things the way you're doing them. So I guess it's just plugging away at that.
I also think dedicated learning time. So essentially how we started mobbing in the first place, and before mobbing was a thing talked about, right? It was basically, we had dedicated learning time, and we were doing katas together, and they were randori katas. And so the person on the team that asked everybody to work this way was saying, hey, can we work on my real work, but in that same format that we were doing driver navigator katas together? And so it might just mean 7 hours a week of dedicated learning time. And it's kind of like attendance is required, but participation is optional. And you just try a mob, or you try TDD, or you try, Those are the types of things that just naturally had these great practices evolve within our group. So people had bandwidth to learn, and then they had retrospectives to ratify new practices. And that's how these changes happened in our environment.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'll see what they think. And Austin, I'll see you on LinkedIn.
Sounds good. See you
Sounds
there.
good. All right, I'm going to add another person, Amit. All right, Amit, if you want to go ahead and introduce your question or questions. I see there's a lot of them here, but they do have the most votes right now.
Cool. So, hey, I'm Amit. I'm a software engineer at Talabat, and I enjoy mob programming. We have been mobbing together for the past 4 months, and it has been amazing. One of the challenges, that I face is that you need to have a certain mindset for mobbing, because sometimes when I work with specialists, or let's say, for example, an iOS engineer, they might not want to sit and write a backend code because they have different career aspirations, right? So which got me thinking, where the problem might lie. Would it be in the hiring pipeline? Which again got me thinking, like, how do you people hire people, right? Do you have a separate designation for ensemble engineers? Also, does your interview pipeline or hiring pipeline vary for these mob programmers in any way?
Yeah, Austin, do you want to start us off on that one?
Yeah. So I think there's kind of two different things that come to mind because we basically have experience with both things you brought up. So one is hiring, right? And so we do have a mob programming style interview we do. So we have a group of people who love to mob and want to keep mobbing, and they want to, we want to hire people who also want to mob. And so we do have a hiring process for that. So basically people will come in. I put a link in the Q&A to more description of this kind of hiring process. But the short version is, we make it very clear in the job posting that, hey, you'll be joining people who love to mob, and this will be part of the interview process. And so they jump in just with one person to kind of ease it in and do a question, like a coding question, basically one-on-one, almost like a pair, but almost like someone saying out loud what they're typing. And then it starts to ease into more and more people joining the pair, and now they're a mob, and then you're working through some questions and you get to know each other. You also do some lean coffee discussions, similar to what we're doing here, afterwards to get to know each other. And so that the goal is for it to serve both ways, right? So one, we get to experience how someone else ensembles or mobs for a few hours. They get to see what it's like in our environment. And hopefully that transparency helps to find a good match. And so so I think you can market, so to speak, job positions specifically for ensembling. And then two, my goal is to put it in response to your question as well, is we do also ensemble with people already in the environments who didn't necessarily get hired with that mindset. And so one example I can think of is someone who's a front end or UI UX specialist. So I'll post a video about both of us doing a talk, sharing our experiences together. But basically, this person has a strong interest in that specialty. So they'll come join an ensemble. They'll do it for a few hours, maybe even a day or so, to help solve a tricky UI UX problem. They might hang out for a little while to see, like, oh, I'm interested how they write a unit test for the layer right underneath that. And so they might hang out for a little bit with some curiosity, but then they'll go back and then go join another mob or another team to do UI UX work. And that's totally fine because the environment is free and they're willing to go and do their thing. And so, anything to add to that, Chris?
I'll say, right now, anybody with a specialist title in our environment, the title means that's what they learn during their learning time, but everybody still optimizes for flow efficiency. And so, and we found that we've even had people leave so in our company, we have a DevOps engineer. They left to go and work on a DevOps specific team. And then they actually came back because they said mobbing is so much more effective because the DevOps metrics can't be moved without the rest of the team. And so it was interesting because the result was that when they're mobbing, they spend less time actually doing DevOps, but the DevOps are actually much more effective at affecting things like DORA metrics, because the team is available and attentive to the DevOps scenario, especially when trying to get something through a pipeline. And so, but specifically about whether or not people want to mob, it is true over the last 6 years, as we grew the team from 5 people to 30 people, we have done a mob style interview. The interview is the same for all the positions, except for specialty positions like DevOps, but everything's mobbed in the sense that the interviewer, the interviewee is navigating their code. And so one thing that we make sure that people are comfortable with is actually verbalizing all of the code. And with the exception of the very first question on our interview, they are programming while listening to somebody navigate them. And we have other interviewers who act as mobbers, asking questions and things like that. And so everything is kind of a mock mob for our work, or for the interview that we do.
Nice. Maybe we can just go for one more question. I think you people already answered the third one, so I'll take the last one. So how do you manage cross mob dependencies without upfront planning?
So are you talking about from a personnel standpoint?
No, from, let's say, a feature standpoint where you require to work with 2 different teams. So how do you plan that upfront? Without upfront planning, how can you really do it?
Yeah, so basically, I think if there's any dependency, it really is cost of delay prioritization entirely. And if the cost of delay doesn't match up, say that another team's resources are applied to something with a much higher cost of delay than what's related to the integration, then maybe it's appropriate to defer the integration. But I would just suggest, from my perspective, we typically, rather than trying to plan everything up front, we get all of the dependencies out of the way first. So for example, we work in the IoT space, and so we have a lot of Internet of Things, and so we have firmware teams and hardware teams out there. And so what we do is we put the highest priority on first on things that are unknown, and so discovery type, pure technical discovery type things, and then we put the second priority on everything that is a dependency, and then the third priority on the remaining features. And so that way everything is done as soon as possible for the dependency. So that way you don't have to upfront plan it. You just say, where are the dependencies? Let's knock out those features first, deliver them to the dependent team, and whether or not they get to using those until much later is fine, but they are available already. So that's been my philosophy. I don't know, Austin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I'm going to try to add a link on prioritization and how that kind of works in our environment. And the one piece that I'll add, kind of from like a boots on the ground perspective, is that I often see your problem get solved because we kind of have a more dynamic reteaming environment where it's not like fixed teams and like only this team can work on that and only this team can work on that. Is often the problem is solved just by inviting someone to your ensemble or mod. So for example, we're about to start work. We were working on something, we finished a few thin vertical slices, and then boom, what comes to the next priority is this thing that everyone in the mob or ensemble really has no idea about, whether it's from a domain or tech perspective. But then you're like, oh, so-and-so in that team, she knows a lot about this. Why don't we just invite her to the mob? She can help build up context, help teach us a few things. Maybe that happens a few times. And it naturally works itself out because usually that person, let's say Sandra, is in another mob. And since she's ensembling with them, they already have a good idea of the things that she's teaching. And so she can leave for a little bit and flow keeps going, right? They have enough context to keep going without it for a while. Then she can go and transfer context and knowledge over here and then go back. And so kind of having that multiple people learning the different skills and disciplines and domains enables people with specific knowledge to jump around and fill the gap and keep that flow going just by inviting them to come. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much. Joaquin, I think you have another question there. As you said, you're very popular, so maybe you want to go and introduce that one.
So this one is, we were running a mobbing experiment, and one thing that we noticed is that some people arrive later, some people arrive earlier, then some of them have interview slots as part of our hiring process that they need to go into, etc., etc. So we ended up having not that much time overlap to mob. So how do you deal with the scheduling pressure and with giving people the flexibility of arriving whenever it's most convenient?
Yeah, so I say that we do have this idea of core working hours where we kind of say if we're going to be available or not, and we have enough team members to collapse down, you know, mobs and things like that as well. So if somebody's by themselves, they can just go and fill in on another mob, and that thing moves forward at the expense of the other thing. But as people are out. And, you know, I guess the other thing that I would say to that is also looking at, you know, maybe not necessarily the interview process, but, you know, timing of everything and, you know, intentionally trying to work with the schedule to make sure that things are, you know, so like one thing that we try to do is we try not to schedule two people in the same mob in an interview. And so, you know, basically what'll happen is, you know, they'll go down to 3 or 2 people, but the work will still go while they're away for the interview. And our interviews are 4 hours long, so we lose a 4-hour block whenever people are out. But, you know, the thing is that mobs are very resilient, you know, if people are around kind of during the same time. And so, you know, and if you can't agree on core working hours, it's not that big of a deal, with the idea that as people arrive, they will take on the work that, you know, as they gain context, and then as people leave, the context can continue forward. And I think what I've seen is, I've actually seen mobs where by the end of the day, the people working on it, on the task, are not the people that started it in the morning. And the work continues on just fine, right? And so I think one big thing about a mob is that the flow efficiency is very high, in the sense that something started will get to its logical end, regardless of who's there and why people are leaving and things like that. Where I think the opposite happens when somebody's not available in an opposite environment. Austin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it, that you know, the teams can figure it out, right? So I've noticed some teams are really, mobs are really resilient to lots of flux, you know what I mean? Like, let's say it's a group of 4, and in the beginning of the morning, it's just 2, because 2 other people are in another meeting. And then it's all 4 people for a couple hours. Then one person drops off to join like a meeting about test-driven development, and they're passionate about that guild or whatever. And so they're off joining that. And now it's down to 3. And then the day might end with 2 people. And so I put in the links a couple stories of teams that are similar, teams that I've been on around the world that have kind of had that flow where it might be solo programming for an hour, and then someone joins, and then they review the code of the last hour, and then it's pairing, and then it turns into a mob. And then after a while, the mob goes back to a pair, and then the day ends, you know? So some teams are really totally fine with that style. Other teams really want to establish that kind of core working hours, things that Chris is talking about. So I put in a link to systems thinking, 5th discipline type book, because I think I saw a post on Twitter recently that basically the overlap was so tiny, it was almost like, is this even worth it? But from what I remember from what the person put in the tweet was that everyone in the system knows there's a pain, right? Everyone's meeting at different times, and there's always conflicts, and everything's out of alignment to achieve flow efficiency. So at that point, it may not be like go with the flow and make it work. It might be like, hey, maybe get the whole system in the room and figure out why everyone is on crazy different schedules, and figure out maybe there's some sort of core working hours that we can block off. And actually, that actually did occur in one of my mobs, whereas that the interruption level was so high that we did establish like, hey, we're going to kind of block out the world for this chunk of time so we can have flow efficiency. And then for this chunk of time, we expect people to be pulled in different directions and we expect a little more chaos. So that was an experiment that helped us when we found ourselves in that kind of thing. And I don't know, Chris, is there time for one more question or we have time?
We can go ahead and invite Sven in. Sven, you have the next question here. I don't know if you want to introduce it.
Okay, hi, I'm Sven, working on Talabat, do a bit of everything here and there. The question I have is, as systems grow and get more complex, then you often have dependencies between systems. And then also, if different teams work in different areas, then at some point they say, hey, I want to do something, but it touches 3-4 other downstream systems. I would admit we are good at when you say a team works in their own stuff, that works. But if you have to do stuff which goes across the complete app at some point and you touch the code of multiple other teams, then you tend to get blocked and you need to ask for help. What's your advice or what's a view you have about those as things grow, complexity increases, and then you avoid just getting blocked? As I really would like to have our teams get better to remove this pain, because then it's also who has a code ownership? Does it travel with the people who mob together or work together? Any tips, guidance, advice?
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why we ended up putting in the rule in place of, no one stays on a product for more than 2 years. One thing that I think before was a reluctance to do just that, to work on or to allow others to just go in and modify something in someone else's code base. And I think a lot of unit tests and stuff help, so automated tests as documentation, I think, is like a really important concept for me. But I think, in our group of 30 people, which is probably a lot smaller context than you're talking about, everybody kind of owns everything. And if there was a dependency and it wasn't the top priority of the group working on that, then that mob would just go in and make the modification to a code base from another product. And so, and that might mean extracting things out to a shared library or whatever. But, I've seen it happen, a number of times before. And I think that it was less likely before people had established themselves for 4 years on a team and things like that. And so I think that, as long as you have high quality, high test automation, then things, need for code review and stuff like that doesn't really exist in our context when working on other products. And then even to the effect where, during kind of like a bout of turnover and other things that were going on, we essentially didn't have access to a full mob working on a product. And we just created another mob out of people that we had available. And they had worked on those things before. Some of them had worked on those things before, some of them hadn't. And there was still knowledge transfer, and there's very little risk around siloing. So that ownership is like essentially a general kind of company-wide ownership, rather than a team owns this chunk of code and no one can come and touch it and things like that. Austin, do you have more to add?
Yeah, so I think since we're down to our last minute, I'll try to be really concise. But I think I'll name James Shore as someone who I've seen have really good advice on this scenario. And he did a talk at a conference once where he basically took the principles from Turn the Ship Around and applied it to kind of the problem you're talking about. And what he was basically saying was, you can't, as a leader of a ginormous system with, let's say 100 teams, figure out one solution that'll work for everybody. It's basically, if you come up with one solution, it'll work for 5% and not work for 95%. So the goal was to show up at teams, coach them, give them, empower them, and then ask them, how can you solve this dependency issue? And to give a quick boots on the ground example is, I've come across this in between mobs internally, between third-party entities where there's dependencies, where there's issues. And the thing we've typically done is we've called it mega mob, where you basically just get together and figure out, whether it's knowledge sharing, figure out the dependency, come up with an interface, and you kind of mob the interface. And it might be a fairly large mob at that point if you're combining, 2 organizations or 2 mobs. It might get into the 8 or 10. And to some people, it might just look like a meeting where you're working on something together. But you establish that interface, you figure out that dependency, and then you can kind of go back to your smaller group. And I've seen that work well several times. I'll throw in the chat a few resources related to that. Yeah.
All right, and I think that's all the time that we have. And so I don't know if we have an outro, maybe from Dragan.
Yeah, just wanted to say that it was a really wonderful session, and I'm sure lots of people got value from it. So yeah, just wanted to thank you, Austin and Chris, for being with us today here.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thanks, everybody.
It was a pleasure. I appreciate all the questions.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.